Hi everyone. As Flo introduced me, I am Natalie Rose. I work in the Geographic Data Science Lab at the University of Liverpool. And I'm really happy to be here today, so thank you to Cato for organising the event. So as you might imagine, in the Geographic Data Science Lab, spatial data is something that's really at the heart of everything that we do. You may have heard some of that already from my colleague's workshop yesterday, if you were able to attend. But today I'll be introducing you to some of my research on essential retailing consumer behaviours during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the added value that spatial data can bring to these results. And this takes the form of a case study on Walmart here in the US. So just to provide a little bit of context to take you back a couple of years, you might remember that Walmart featured fairly heavily in the media during this time as it sort of emerged as one of the quote-unquote winners of the pandemic. So a lot of this came down to things like their essential retail status, which allowed them to stay open, the grocery offerings of the store amongst many other different varied product types, and also the sheer coverage of the brand. So that's both with brick and mortar stores and online presence across the US. So I've just included a few different article examples here that document some of these wins that we saw. So we see headlines on the left-hand side here with, phrases such as surging profits and, taking an edge in the grocery market, extending pandemic winning streaks. And it was reported that the company's profits grew by about 45% during the really early stages of the pandemic. A large chunk of this might be attributed to their online retailing successes, as we see on the right-hand side of this slide. And then I've also included just a snippet of the media that Walmart themselves released that sort of remind us of the different interventions that were put in place during that period, such as social distancing, to keep, retailing as safe as it could be. So I mentioned before that this project really looks at the onset of the pandemic. And here is a brief timeline of some of the key events that happened over that time. So we have the key milestones in terms of virus transmission across the top, and then along the bottom, we have the government reactions to those unfolding events. So Washington was the first state to declare a state of emergency on January 30th. However, a national emergency was not declared until a few weeks later, and that's when the state-issued closures started to occur on a much larger scale. And then on April 20th, some of the first states started to ease these stringencies and the restrictions that were put on businesses. So this de-escalation of the stringency measures is the end of the time frame that we will be looking at here. So this research asks the following key questions. How do the trends in sales outcomes for 2020 compare with previous years? What effect did the imposition of these stringency measures have on national sales trends in 2020 specifically? And then to what extent can we see this spatial variation in outcomes across different states? So to do this, we brought together a number of different data sets, each that had a spatial aspect. So the Walmart sales data for this project was procured through Factious, who are a financial insights company, and this was made available from SafeGraph through their COVID-19 data consortium. So this consortium was set up in response to the pandemic to support related research, both in the US and abroad as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about this data in detail in a subsequent slide. Another key component of this research is the stringency indices, which record the strictness of the lockdown measures. And this was procured through the Oxford COVID-19 response tracker. So uniquely for the US, this provides both the national level stringency measures and also the state level, because the way your governance works is kind of different to everyone else's. Also used in the model, the SafeGraph Core Places dataset was able to give us coordinate locations of every Walmart store across the country. We had demographic and socioeconomic variables, which were procured through the 2019 American Community Survey. And then finally, I am a massive advocate for not underestimating the value of weather and the influence of that when it comes to sales outcomes. So this is something I look a lot at in my research. And we use two different weather data sets here. So first we have the weather source climatology data set, which is through the CARTO data catalogue, and then also the daily summaries data from the NOAA. So as promised, a little bit more of information on the Walmart data itself. So we were able to get daily transaction counts and daily total spend outcomes for both in-store and online. And this was aggregated at the zip code level of the purchasing card holder rather than pertaining to specific stores. The data covers right back from January 2017 through to April 2020. And it is collected by Factious through challenger banks, payroll cards, and government cards. So it's not an exhaustive record of all the transactions and all the sales that were made at Walmart during this time. But it's a pretty good, we get a good representation, and it's a lot of data, so it's really, really useful. So we can first look at the sort of time series trends from the start of 2017, and this is at national level for the whole US. The data you see in red, hopefully it's clear enough, is the data for 2020. So on the top right graph, you can see that there's a sort of notable decline in in-store transactions, and the distinct sort of year-on-year increases that we saw up to the point of early 2020 don't seem to be continuing in the same way. If we look at spend, however, the same sort of trend isn't as evident. So we see that there's still the large peak around mid-March that we've seen in previous years. But then maybe at the end, we are seeing a bit more of a peak right towards the end of this time series in mid-April. If we look over at online trends, both transactions and spend show very similar peaks sort of in mid-March to what we've seen in previous years. But then what's really notable is this very distinct increase into April. And we see this huge peak, which significantly deviates from previous years. And then we can introduce the spatial aspect and examine this at the state level. So here we have in-store transactions. The green, hopefully it's clear enough on the thing, the green is 2019 and the blue is 2020. So we can directly compare sort of year-on-year trends here. I should have mentioned previously that this is the 48 contiguous states. It is not all 50. And the projected grid layout isn't perfect, but if you are looking for specific states, hopefully they are in the right sort of area. Obviously, it gets a bit more tricky when they're all quite close together in the eastern northeast area. However, so we can directly compare the sales a bit more closely. And primarily, we can see some significant spatial variation in these trends. So it's not just as simple as, say, year-on-year decline as we saw at the national level. And I appreciate there's a lot to take in with this kind of diagram. So I can highlight a couple of notable trends that we see in the data. So here along the West Coast, so we've got Washington, Oregon, and California, we tend to see similar year-on-year trends, but we see them at a lower magnitude as to how they happened in 2019. We also have instances of similarly lower magnitudes, but different trends than we saw previously. So here I've highlighted Montana and Wyoming. And then in some instances, we see higher sales in 2020 than 2019. So pulled out here is an example of Ohio and West Virginia. And then finally, there are more instances where we see very little difference in trends. So actually, from this kind of point of view, we don't see much change between the 2 years. We can also then do the same thing for online transactions in 2019 and 2020. And we see here quite a different story with an almost universal trend of Very, very similar sales up until about mid to late March and into April, where we see this huge takeoff in online sales transactions. So the main analysis of this research examines the effect of imposed stringency measures on these sale outcomes. Then this covers January 2020 through April 2020. So to do this, we employed a multi-level modelling approach. I won't go too in-depth on the methods. Obviously, we have a short time frame here. But multi-level modelling is a regression-based method that allows the intercept or the slope of the regression line to vary, or both together as well. You can have both a varying intercept and slope model. So in this instance, we chose a random intercept model and allowed the intercepts to vary both by stringency grouping and by state. And the stringency categories we used, so the index itself is scaled from 0 to 100, and we broke it up as such. And the results that we get from this model, aside from your sort of standard regression table, look a bit like this. So here we have the intercept values for in-store and online transactions at a national level, and how they change as you vary across stringency group. So 0 on the y-axis represents the average that you would get from a non-varying model. The particularly small values we see on the left for in-store transactions indicate that there is virtually no change at this level across different stringencies. Conversely, for online, we see this pattern of sort of declining intercept values in the early stages of stringency, which then start to reverse going through the third and fourth levels. And then in a similar way to before, we can examine this at state level. So in this instance, we have in-store intercept shown in red and the online intercept shown in blue. And we can really see how much variability is masked at the national level. So it's particularly where with in-store transactions, we saw kind of no real significant change at all. And that's just not the case here. So again, a lot to take in. I've highlighted some trends that we can look at. So firstly, we have instances of sustained declines across stringency levels. So this is seen in in-store transactions most prominently, but also evident in these online transactions as well. Ohio, I've picked out, I think, as the only state where the in-store transactions at the highest stringency appear to be greater than with 0 stringencies. In some instances, we see mirroring trends. So both in-store and online transactions seem to do the same thing. We see that. I've sort of outlined the Dakotas here as an example. Other places, we see diverging trends. So quite often, most of the time, this is seen with increasing online and decreasing in-store transactions. So although the increase in online transactions appear to happen at a much slower rate, so it's not quite making up for the decrease that we see in in-store transactions. And we can do the same thing for spend outcomes as well. So similarly, these graphs, we can see for in-store spend that actually we get a sort of sustained decline throughout the different stringency levels. For online, we see this decline and then a reversal at a slightly later stage than we saw before, at going into the highest levels of stringency. And we see more consistency in the state level trends when we look at spend than we do for transaction. We tend to see more mirroring of trends, so both online and in-store doing the similar things, rather than those converging or diverging trends that we saw previously. But one thing that we do see sort of pop up in a few states is this change in trend, so a peak or a decline, predominantly around the second stringency group. So in the case of Wisconsin, Illinois, Rhode Island, we see this either peak or sort of trough significant at this level. And then for California, I've also highlighted a similar thing, but we see it at the third level. So that feels like a lot of information to unpack, but just a few key takeaways before I wrap up. Generally, we found that, nationally, consumers are making fewer but larger physical shopping trips, whereas for online sales outcomes, we have this ubiquitous increase in transactions and spend. When we modelled, there were notable and significant impacts of increasing stringencies, and it's clear the added value you get from those different spatial levels. So much of the variation that we saw was masked, and then the sort of looking at it at a varying spatial scale, we were able to see a lot more of the variation. So I think that's all from me. Happy to take any questions if there's time, but if not, please come and find me, and I'd be happy to talk about it.